Hi everyone, my name's Darryl Panes, CEO at As Good as Gold Australia, and today, once again, I'm joined by my brother Brian and partner at As Good as Gold. And today we interview John Adams, Chief Economist at As Good as Gold Australia. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon, Darryl and Brian.
Good afternoon.
John, I believe today we've got a very important subject to discuss. Not that any of the other subjects we've discussed in the past, Brian, have been of little matter.
No.
However, I think that today it is really important to discuss this issue. As our viewers would know, over the past couple of years, we've talked consistently about protecting your wealth.
Okay.
And we've referred to gold and silver as a means of doing that.
It's only part of it, isn't it?
It's only part of it, and it's an important, very important part. I know that Egon von Grey is right now, and I keep making reference to this because it is so important. Egon will say, upon being asked the question, how much should I invest in precious metals? Egon will say, whatever you can't afford to lose, which means that if you had 100,000 and you couldn't afford to lose $10 of that 100,000, you're all in. So. And we know historically that gold and silver have been the safe haven investment, which is why we have spoken so clearly about this subject for so long. However, and I will say this, as one gets older, and I do say older, not old, as one gets older, it becomes even more important to protect your wealth because you don't have as long to recover if you make a bad decision.
Yes, that's right. As hard as I'd like to say I want to live to 105, it's probably only going to be 85. And so the risk factor becomes greater as you get older.
So that is correct. So today's conversation is really important because we're going to be talking about protecting your wealth. But right now as we speak, there's a critical fight which is happening in the federal parliament regarding the issue of bail-in. And the bail-in, of course, is the ability of the banks to withhold retail deposits. Now, not everyone fully understands this. And I think before we get too involved in this conversation today, what is important is that John could explain to our audience what bail-in is. What does it really mean? So, John, if I could ask you that question first.
So think about a bank or a financial institution that gets into financial trouble, that's insolvent, it potentially could go bankrupt, and just say you want to save the bank. There's two ways effectively that you can save a bank. Either an external injection of money comes into the bank from outside the bank, and that's what we call a bailout, whether that money comes from government or other private sector corporations, other banks, etc. Or you can try to find the money within the bank, and that's what we call bail-in. So bail-in is when a bank converts its liabilities, its debts, into owner's equity. So what that actually would mean in practice is whether you have bonds, hybrid securities, deposits, etc. If a bank was in trouble and they conducted a bail-in, they would convert those bonds, deposits, etc., into shares in the bank. Effectively, what we're saying is we're talking about confiscation.
And that wouldn't suit, what you've just described wouldn't suit everybody at that particular moment. So it's not how we've read it in the past.
No, it's not. We always thought, growing up as kids, that the bank was as safe as houses.
Yeah, but that is, you're saying that is not the case.
Yes.
John? Okay.
Okay. We in the past, and if we go back to 2013 in Cyprus, that was the first bail-in that I had ever heard about. So that was about 7 years ago. But apparently it's happened in Australia as well, John. Can you explain to our audience what happened in these case studies?
In 2013, the Bank of Cyprus, the whole financial system in Cyprus got into trouble when the Greek crisis happened in 2012. And so a number of banks went bust in Cyprus, but the government they made the decision that they wanted to save the bank, one bank, which is called the Bank of Cyprus. So at that point, the bank got some money from the European Union, but also what they did was they confiscated deposits and converted them into shares. And so by about halfway through 2013, 47.5% of deposits above 100,000 euros were converted into bank shares. And basically, for those who went through that process, it was, they haven't been able to recover financially. So a huge, horrific process in that. So for a lot of people, kind of like what you said, Brian, for a lot of people who looked at that situation in Cyprus, this was the first known case for a lot of people that I've never seen this before, where a bank takes deposits and convert them into shares. Now, I started poking around this space a couple of years ago, and I think in early last year, I was at the University of Wollongong reading about the depression that happened in Australia in 1892 and 1893, and it was quite surprising to me because in Melbourne, a number of banks went bust. And during that process, they did exactly the same thing. They basically bailed in retail bank deposits. So in that case, in Melbourne, it was called reconstruction. So a bank that was insolvent, what they did was they created a new bank. And that new bank, basically what they said was, if you're a depositor in this bankrupt bank, we're going to take your deposits and we're going to make you a shareholder in a new bank, and that new bank would continue to trade. So that's what they called reconstruction, and it's exactly the same process effectively as to what happened with the Bank of Cyprus, which is your liabilities, the liabilities of the bank, which is deposits, converted into shares.
So 120 years ago, it happened in Australia, and they called it bank reconstruction. I love the names. I love the names that they come up with. Quantitative easing, bank of reconstruction. Wow, and 120 years ago.
Yeah, so most of us don't understand what those terms really mean.
I never knew it.
So we're confused. So it just goes over the top of the head and move on.
Move on. Yeah.
One thing I just wanted to sort of say was that the reason why the Melbourne case study is important is when I've talked about this for the last couple of years, a lot of people have said, well, Cyprus has no relation to Australia. Cyprus is a small country in Europe. It has an unsophisticated financial system. Australia is modern. These things don't happen to us. Our banks are strong. Everything's fine. It's a conspiracy theory to believe that this could ever happen in Australia. And yet, when you look at Australian history, it's already happened to us. And who knows whether Australia actually invented this process to begin with.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do know we're at 2020 at the moment, and this was a very long time ago when we experienced anything similar to what you're talking about. You'd think 2020, we've moved on. John, why right now would this be relevant to Australia and the Australian people at large?
So after the global financial crisis, global policymakers came to the view that if another financial crisis was to happen again, the taxpayers wouldn't be able to afford these huge bailout packages. So the G20 in particular, that they basically said, we've got this we've got this problem with bailing out banks, this too big to fail problem. So they said to themselves, well, we need to come up with new mechanisms to save the banking system without writing a blank check. So if you think about after Lehman Brothers, I think the bailout package by Congress initially was about $700-800 billion. And then you had all the stimulus packages on top. Then you had the US Federal Reserve printing $15 to $20 trillion trying to save the global financial system. And they just said there has to be a better way. Otherwise, we're going to bankrupt ourselves trying to save the banking system. So the G20 set up an organization called the Financial Stability Board, or the FSB. And Australia's a part of the G20. So they came up with a global framework of new resolution tools of how do you resolve an insolvent bank. And one of those tools is bail-in. So not only did bail-in happen in Cyprus in 2013, bail-in has become a global policy tool which countries around the world have signed on to say that we will adopt this technique if our banks get into trouble. Now, so Australia signed a couple of key documents in 2010 and 2014 as part of the G20. Fast forward to 2017, and the Turnbull government introduced legislation into federal parliament which would amend the Banking Act to give the government and APRA, the regulator, more powers to resolve banks that are in financial trouble. And so they made a number of changes that would allow bail-in to occur. So at that point in 2017, there was an intense campaign to bring attention as to, does this apply to deposits or not? And during the Senate inquiry, they heard a whole host of evidence. And the evidence, so the Parliament came to the conclusion that deposits were safe, and there was nothing to see here. And that law, so that proposed legislation became law in February of 2018. So by about October of 2018, when I started to look at this issue, I actually found a legal loophole. So I found a way that they could do it with the way the law is constructed now. And this is something that you and I have talked about on previous shows with As Good as Gold. I've spoken about it at some of our seminars. I've also spoken about it at length with Martin North back in 2018, as well as this year and last year. And where we are today is we have legislation in Parliament that's been introduced by Senator Malcolm Roberts, which would close some of these loopholes to make the law crystal clear that deposits can't be touched.
Well, look.
Okay. Oh, well, that's vital news. Yeah, it's Brian.
No. Yeah, look, while you were talking there, I thought about my history as growing up and whatever. And, you know, we were taught to be savers right from primary school ages. And saving, there would be a certain day you go to school and you have your bank account with you and you'd place some money in that bank account. It might have been 1 shilling or 10 cents or what it might have been 50 cents if you were rich. But the bottom line here was you were always taught that the banks would look after your money, safe as houses, and you can withdraw it at any time. Obviously, there's a lot of water under the bridge since then. And it is that belief that I'm questioning now with holding too much money in a bank. Nothing wrong with banks, but what the question will be is banking today the same as it was back then? So how should Australians view their bank accounts and their deposits, John?
Pretty much like you said. So when I was in primary school here in New South Wales, I mean, we had those Dolomite accounts because at that point the Commonwealth Bank was still owned by the federal government. And, I would say that for about 4 or 5 decades, we've been raised with this belief that banks are the safe custodian of our money and that it's a safe place to put our savings, our life savings. The reality is, and a lot of this has become more prominent after the GFC. So when you look at the balance sheet of a bank, it's got its assets, it's got its liabilities, it's got its owner's equity. Deposits are a liability to the bank because the bank has to pay those depositors their money back in terms of, that money being in terms of their deposits. So depositors are legally unsecured creditors to the bank. So what that means in practice is when you put your money in a bank account, you legally have given the bank a loan. You are a creditor to the bank, and with any loan that you may have, I mean, the problem with any form of a loan is the risk of default. So Darryl and Brian, if I gave you money and you said you're going to pay me back, even though I trust you, there's always that implicit risk of maybe they won't pay me back, and that's obviously the issue that most Australians are not aware of, that they are unsecured creditors to the bank. And I thought it was very instructive when I was in Adelaide in February with you guys, and we did a seminar with some of our fans and customers, in Adelaide. And I asked the question, who in this room has given someone a loan? And there was about maybe 120, 130 people in the room, and only one person in the room knew that their bank account was a loan to the bank. And whereas everyone else was pretty clueless on that point. So I think it's a major point that most Australians need to understand, which 99.9% of people have no idea, that when you have a bank account, it's a loan to the bank.
Well, like terms and conditions, once again, isn't it? I mean, there's just reams and reams and reams of documentation in that section, and no one ever gets to the end of it, which is where most of these issues start to raise their...
Exactly. I mean, who does use the book that you get when you deposit money for the first time? You get a book about the bank's terms and conditions, and it's like a legal document, and it is a legal document. And how many read the fine print of all legal documents? Because some of them are they're more than 2 pages long. There's sometimes 102. So you leave it, you actually trust the organisation that's written those terms and conditions. So, I think it's just a matter of now reading terms and conditions. And maybe something to think about is that the bank should be more or less a short-term deposit holder rather than a long-term deposit holder. So in other words, you want to be buying some hard assets. With the majority of your savings.
Yeah. Look, I think the important thing here too is that Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation Party has apparently, and you could confirm this, John, proposed new legislation which would prevent the federal government from ordering a bail-in of retail bank deposits. What is the name of the proposed legislation? And what would the proposed legislation do if enacted?
Kind of like what I said before. So Malcolm Roberts has introduced legislation in Parliament. The legislation is called the Banking Amendment Deposits Bill 2020. What the bill would do, the bill would, so basically in current law, there is this ability to bail in a whole host of financial and capital instruments, and so the bill would basically make it would carve out a legal exclusion for deposits, so that if they wanted to convert or bail in, in terms of other forms of securities, they can, but they just can't touch deposits.
So what chance is there of this new proposed legislation moving forward and being supported?
So about a month ago, the Senate resolved to move this legislation to an inquiry. So the Senate Economics Legislation Committee is now looking at the bill. The last week was the last week in which submissions were due and were able to be lodged. So I put in my own submission, which is the most definitive account of this issue. 32 pages, 5 attachments with legal opinion calling out specific parts of the law. So now these submissions are being published by the Parliament. I've been dealing with quite a few media organisations who are researching this issue and are going to be reporting about this to the press. We are still unclear as to whether a public hearing is to be called and whether I'll be able to testify to the senators with my evidence. But the committee is required to report back to the full Senate with their conclusions of their inquiry by the 10th of August. So we've got about 3.5 weeks left to go for the inquiry to finish. In my submission, I went through quite a bit of detail to explain, what is bail-in, what is its history, what international commitments has Australia signed on to that would because we've committed ourselves internationally to this global bail-in regime. What have other countries done, and obviously what is the state of federal Commonwealth law in Australia, and how can the law be used as it is written today to bail in retail deposits?
Just a matter of interest, how many countries are there at the moment that you've suggested, and you have in the past, that are confronted with this same legislation, bail-in legislation? I know it was the G20.
Yes. So the G20 has signed on to the global framework. There have been a range of other countries that have also signed on as well. How many? So for example, there's a number of major countries that have deposits on the table as a financial instrument that can be bailed in. So the most transparent regime is New Zealand. In New Zealand, they have the government has actually a website. It's called Open Bank Resolution. And if you read that carefully, it actually says that if a bank is to be in trouble, they will freeze your deposit, as in that's a capital control. And then if they need to take some of your deposit to recapitalize the bank, they will do that. So New Zealand's the most transparent, but the United States, the European Union, in terms of the UK, Hong Kong, Canada, there's a whole host of countries around the world that have, pretty openly stated that deposits are on the table. But I have to say, the government that has been the most explicit about this is our friends across the pond.
I guess the question now, John, is how do Australians ultimately protect themselves from the risk of bail-in? I mean, what role, and here again, what is the role of precious metals here? And we've spoken about this, but I'd love some feedback from you. What's the role that physical gold and silver may play in protecting Australians' wealth?
Thanks for the question, Darryl. So, I would really like to make about 3 or 4 points on this issue. So the first one is, so Australians need to be educated about this issue of bail-in, the state of the law, particularly if Parliament doesn't pass Senator Robertson's bill. The risk of this issue, that's still on the table, and so it's unclear as to what Parliament will do. But I would say that the government's submission, and when I say the government, as in the Treasury's submission was published yesterday, and the government is formally arguing against closing these loopholes. So the government says there's nothing to see here. I would argue, and I've got letters from lawyers to say that there is definitely a issue on the table. So we'll see how the inquiry process plays out and what the final outcome of that is. But there was an interesting statistic about a month ago. I was listening to Martin North, and he was referring to a private sector study that said that about 74% of Australians are feeling financially stressed because of the COVID-19 lockdowns. 26% felt fine. Now, I'm one of those 26%, and I've had quite a few emails from people across the country who read my 2018 plan. So in 2018, I wrote a 10-step plan of how do you prepare for an economic crisis, and quite a few Australians around the country read that. A number of people actually took my advice and actually took steps to make their financial position stronger, like getting out of debt, holding good money, cash flow, and doing a range of other steps that are advocated. And those people who followed my advice back then are doing quite well or doing okay now. So the main point about bail-in and in terms of banks is, if you think that everything is okay and then you sail into a crisis, by the time you get into the crisis, it's too late, because you just won't get access to your money, or the money could be confiscated or bailed in already. So I'm always someone who's very keen at looking at things ahead of time and trying to take prudent steps to make sure that if a adverse situation does come about, that you're ready for it. And some people call this conspiracy theory, or you're a doomsday. I don't view it like that at all. I view it as scenario analysis. If this scenario were to happen, how are you positioned financially to prepare yourself? So for me personally, what I can say is, as I've looked into this issue, and so there's a range of issues with banks. I mean, you've got the global debt bubble, we've got an Australian debt bubble that's linked to property. You have this issue of we've got zero interest rates, or 0.25 in terms of Australia, but zero elsewhere around the world. There's a risk of negative interest rates, and then you have this risk of in terms of bail-in. And so given that when you put money in a bank, you are legally a lender to the bank, you've given the bank a loan. If you don't want to face those risks with the banking system, the easiest thing to do is to withdraw your money from the banking system and then deploy your capital by doing something else with it. So for me personally, and I've been buying precious metals now for about 4 years, and I've been with As Good as Gold Australia for more than 2 years. What I've done personally with my money is, so I still use the banks. I still have a bank account. I have a credit card. So obviously, you can't function in Australia today without those banking services. But when it comes to my life savings, because of the risks of bail-in, negative interest rates, and all the other issues on the table, I've withdrawn my money out of the banking system and I've put it basically into precious metals. Now, obviously, there are risks with precious metals. There are different risks with precious metals that have to be accounted for. But I made the personal determination that when you look at money printing, when you look at the issue with the banks and how do you preserve your wealth and how do you save, precious metals was the most prudent way to go forward based on current conditions. And when you look at world history and in terms of economic history, so the other thing I would say is that a lot of Australians think about gold and silver as an investment. Now, maybe it's because bullion under the tax code is treated as an investment because you're subject to capital gains tax. But historically speaking, before we had fiat currency, gold and silver was actually money. So one of the things I like to say to people is, well, if you want to save your money, there's a number of ways you can save it. You can save it in Australian dollars. You can save it in foreign currency. You can save it in a bank. You can save it in physical cash. Or you can hold physical gold, physical silver, and that's not an investment. That is your saving. So that's the way I've chosen to save my money. And I know that you guys have been doing it for a very long time. And Robert Kiyosaki is one who's been for decades saving his money in gold and silver. And so that's how I view in terms of bullion. I mean, you have the ability to save in bullion. You have the ability to save your money in the bank, and there are different issues and risks that to be adjusted. So if people are, as people get educated on this issue of bail-in, about this proposed legislation, what the Parliament may or may not do, closing these loopholes. If people are, wanting some peace of mind as to, where things are going moving forward, bullion, holding bullion, that's obviously an option of how people can save their money. And I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with COVID-19 and what's going to happen with the European banking system, but there was an article about a month ago published by the Irish Times, and they referred to a new European study saying that effectively, if COVID-19 goes, if it was to go into 2021, Europe would be facing a banking crisis. So, we're not out of the woods, obviously. We still have this global debt bubble. Central banks have been printing like crazy to stop the debt bubble from imploding. So far, they've been able to hold the show intact largely. But if you start to see defaults, if things, if they don't print enough stimulus, or if the stimulus just has not the same effect as it has had to date, could we see, financial disruption, banks going under in 2021? That is a risk. That's a risk that other international economists and bankers are trying to call out. And again, this is not doomsday theory or conspiracy theory. It's all about scenario analysis and taking prudent action that if, God forbid, the worst was to come, that you are in the best position to handle those conditions.
Yeah, John, timing is everything. And it reminded me of a quote I heard a couple of months back, and it's exactly related to what you're saying. The quote basically says, you can't teach somebody how to swim when they're already drowning. And when you think about it, if you're drowning, there's no good teaching them how to swim at that stage. You've got to be very much prepared before that date.
It's a little bit like the oxygen mask, isn't it, in a plane? And I've made reference to this before, but if we've all experienced it, you board a flight, not so much of late, but you board a flight and you're instructed to consider the policies of the flight, the safety on board the flight, and of course the host or hostess relays that information to you. And one of those, of course, one of the references is to making sure that if there is a problem on the plane, that you put the oxygen mask over your own face first. Why would you do that? Because then you're in control. Then at least you're in a position to be able to help somebody else. Without doing that, you are vulnerable. And I guess Jim Sinclair says it pretty well. And we make reference to Jim regularly. I mean, why not? He's a billionaire with a B. And Jim says it's a pretty simple formula. Just become your own central bank. If central banks, all of them, own gold, and they own gold because it gives them power and influence. It's stable. It supports the currency.
Stable monetary system.
Yeah. So if it's good enough for them, even though I may not like the policies that they introduce generally, however, if it's good enough for them to own gold, then it's certainly, and Jim Sinclair, it's good enough for me.
Us.
Yeah,
absolutely. John, just to finish, if people want to read a copy of your full submission, how do they get hold of it?
Probably a couple of ways. So it has been published on the parliamentary website, the Federal Parliament's website, so they can easily go there. If people want to contact me via As Good As Gold, or through my own personal website, happy to receive correspondence. What I've always tried to do with you guys and with Martin North and everyone is to do the best research I can and to make it public and make it free, and everyone can read it and critique it and tell me if I'm right or wrong. So why don't we put my As Good As Gold email in the notes to our YouTube discussion, and if people want to email me and get a copy, feel free to, and happy to share it.
That sounds good enough for me. We'll do that.
Any final points, any final remarks, John, before we close off today?
Probably a couple of points. First one is, in the next few days, there will be some media stories about this issue. So I am talking with the ABC and the Financial Review and a few other publications. So there will be some stories. So look out for that. I should say, just before we started recording, literally about 10 to 15 minutes before, I got an email. And so one of the submissions that was received by the committee, so this is a former policy advisor to the Australian Banking Association, says that no, we shouldn't close these loopholes. We should actually make it explicit that deposits are at risk in Australia. So they're actually going in the opposite direction, and their argument is that if people know that deposits are at risk from bail-in, then it will create market discipline. People will be more careful with their money. So I was sort of shocked when I read that just before we started recording. But there is someone on the other side saying that no, let's not make it safer. Let's actually make it more riskier for mum and dad depositors.
Well,
can't come to grips with that.
No, don't see it that way.
John, look, thank you once again. I did mention at the beginning of this interview that I thought the conversation today was of vital importance, and I believe that all of our viewers today will feel the same way about what they've heard. John, we once again thank you so much for your time. Really appreciative. The 2 years that we've had John on board has been a godsend to us, really.
Yeah.
I mean, John spends countless hours researching all of his subjects, and I know that the information he provides is well received by all of our subscribers all around the world. John, thank you so much again for your support again today, and we look forward to connecting with you again very shortly, because things are really starting to mount a charge at the moment, aren't they? I mean,
absolutely.
Changes, policies are changing place by the day. One doesn't really know whether today we may be able to catch a flight and fly over to Queensland. Who knows tomorrow? Changes are being made overnight. So volatile world, something we've never experienced before, but difficult and challenging times ahead. Thanks, John. Thanks so much for your support today. We also would like to thank our subscribers.
Absolutely.
For their continued support. You are invaluable and supporting this channel as you do. And so I'd like to say, and it won't be long, we will be, from this point onwards, providing interviews with lots of different people around the world, and on a more regular basis, because we know the feedback from you is suggesting that. So we will oblige and connect with you more often. Until then, could we ask you to stay well, stay focused, and goodbye for now.
And goodbye for now.